Some men will do anything for love, and some will go even further for revenge. Prepare yourself for the true story of Alfred Busher. Our story begins in the hills of Kentucky in 1926. It's here that a man named Lee Armstrong was living a simple but prosperous life on his 50-acre farm, raising rye and oats. The homestead had been passed down in his family for the past 3 generations. And once, it had been over 100 acres before the Illinois Central Railroad used eminent domain to run a set of tracks right through the center of his farm. But for his part, Mr. Armstrong didn't mind those tracks. Besides, that train had brought a lot of economic improvements to the area, and now farmers were earning more money since they could ship their crops further. Now, Lee was the type of fella who worked from sunup to sundown, and despite his advanced age, he could work circles around most young fellas. In his mind, these young whippersnappers just didn't have the instinctive get up and go or take pride in their work like men folks used to do. But in spite of this, Mr. Armstrong was known to hire out an extra set of hands each growing season to help out around the farm. So, in the spring of 1926, he hired a man named Alfred Busher. Now, Alfred was a short, red-faced and red-haired fella who was a bit of a drifter who had been rambling through Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky over the past few years, picking up odd jobs and never staying in one place for more than a few months. He had grown up in the city, and quite frankly, he didn't have any experience working in the fields or with animals. But he had given Mr. Armstrong a promise to work hard, along with a firm handshake. And since farm help was so hard to find back in those days, the farmer decided to give the green hand a chance and quickly put him to work baling hay and feeding the hogs. In return, Alfred received free room and board in the barn and 3 meals a day. Now, truth be told, sleeping with the chickens in the barn wasn't ideal. The hours were long and the pay was poor. But as it turned out, there was at least one good reason to stay, and that was the farmer's daughter, Grace. That's right. Each and every day when the rooster crowed, Alfred opened his eyes and was resolved to march right up to Mr. Armstrong and tell him that he was quitting. But each time he made it to breakfast in the main house and caught the sight of Grace in her apron, prancing around the kitchen with her beautiful smile as she served him coffee and biscuits, somehow Alfred would suddenly find the inspiration to work at least one more day. Now, Grace wasn't 18 yet, but in those days, girls married young. And living on a big old farm 10 miles away from town, she had never even been courted by a boy before. Oh, she was a beautiful girl who was just hidden away from the world's eyes. She was a friendly gal, too, and she liked to listen to Alfred talk about all the places he had traveled to. So the two would talk over coffee in the mornings and even at supper each night before Alfred went back to the barn to sleep with the chickens. For his part, Alfred had never had a meaningful conversation with a pretty girl in his life, and before you knew it, he was head over heels in love with her. He spent each day thinking about her as he plodded along behind a mule out in the fields. He'd always start each day on the far side of the railroad that ran through the farm, and after that morning train came through, he would cross the tracks and spend the afternoon working closer to the house, all the while dreaming about the farmer's daughter. After a month or so, Alfred couldn't hide his true feelings for her anymore, and one day after breakfast, as Grace was cleaning up the morning dishes in the kitchen, Alfred professed his love to her. Now, she tried to be as polite and as gentle as possible in rejecting him, and she assured him that her father would never approve of her being with a farmhand. No, she wanted much more in a man. In fact, in Grace's mind, the perfect man would be a train engineer, Oh, that would be the perfect husband. After all, they made good money and they weren't at home that much. And what little time they were at home, they were hopeless romantics. Best of all, a woman always knew where her engineer was simply by looking at the train schedule. At first, Alfred didn't think too much about Grace's engineer talk. It was just foolishness, he thought to himself. And now that he had told Grace how he truly felt about her, he was determined to win her heart. Surely, she would eventually change her mind. The next morning, Alfred was cutting the hay near the railroad tracks when he heard the approaching morning train in the distance. He had never paid too much attention to it before, until this moment. It suddenly came to Alfred that he realized that he had noticed that nearly every morning around 9:15, that train sure did seem to do a lot of fancy and needless tooting just before it reached the Armstrong farmhouse. And after it passed, the whistle would always give 3 toots, followed by 4 more with a short kind of a question mark inflection at the end. So today, Alfred paid careful attention to every detail when that train passed the Armstrong farm. First, there was the sound of the engine coming down the tracks. Then, the sound of the kitchen door from the main house squeaked as young Grace ran out, fluffing her bobbed hair and straightening her apron. Then, Alfred noticed that the engineer, he was sitting in his proper post all right, but instead of keeping his eyes on the tracks ahead for any potential danger, they were instead fixed on the beautiful young Grace. Oh, that was bad enough. But then Alfred saw the engineer grinning from ear to ear and waving a black gloved hand before blowing her a kiss. And worst of all, Grace waved back with her eyes sparkling as she stood, waiting and listening for the rumbling train as it faded into the distance. A sudden revelation of understanding came to Alfred as he quickly confronted Grace and promptly told her that he wouldn't tolerate any woman of his that he was engaged to be flirting with a train engineer. And Grace, well, she just laughed at him and told him he was plumb crazy if he thought she would ever marry a man like him. Then she proceeded to decipher the Morse code of the train horn.
You see, Alfred, the first 3 toots are the engineer saying to me, "I love you." And the last 4 toots as the train fades into the distance is him asking me, "Will you marry me?"
Oh, that's hogwash, Alfred replied. Well, the reason he's so good at tooting that horn is because he's had lots of practice. Can't you see that, Grace? That fella does it to all the girls.
Well, maybe he does, but I'd much rather be the last love of a nice engineer than the first and only of some people I know.
And then she turned and went back into the kitchen and left Alfred alone, standing in the middle of the field in the hot sun.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit the appalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
Day after day, it went on. Nearly the same scene each time, with Grace running to wave at the kiss-blowing engineer, and the terrible sounds of that train whistle, showering the Armstrong farm with professions of the engineer's love for Grace. Alfred couldn't help but to stop what he was doing and torture himself by watching the ceremony unfold. And even when he couldn't see it, he knew what was going on. Every day, likewise, he tried to persuade the girl to ignore that grinning engineer and pay attention to all the love that Alfred was ready to give. But all Alfred got out of the discussions was a lot of reasons why he, a farmhand, wasn't nearly as desirable a man as a handsome engineer. In his defense, Alfred argued that this particular engineer, he was a bad one. After all, that engineer was wasting a good many pounds of Illinois Central Railroad steam, and he was neglecting his duty, all to flirt with women who happened to live along the right-of-way. I tell you right now, that engineer's gonna meet his match one day, and there will be a mighty bad end for a fella like him. And so it was. Alfred's mind was just like the little branch of the railroad that ran through the heart of the Armstrong farm. It was a one-track affair. And day after day, Alfred couldn't put that old engineer out of his mind as he worked the plow or fed the hogs. Months went by, and afore long, the farmhand began dreaming of the day that engineer would have a grand old accident and wreck that train. Surely that would wipe the grin off of his face for good. The thought of such an accident grew on him. A terrible train disaster. Oh, that was a pleasant picture to Alfred's mind. He dreamed of the engineer laying at the bottom of a pile of steel, with the engine resting on his neck as he was cooked to death with scalding steam. And for weeks, Alfred dreamed of this terrible wreck, yet it never came. Instead, the train would pass each morning at 9:15, with both the engineer and Grace blowing kisses at one another, while Alfred cleaned up after the hogs. That was it. He couldn't take it any longer. If fate wouldn't intervene on his behalf, by God, he'd take matters into his own hands. And what happens next would send shockwaves all across America. But what was the best way to carry out his plan? If he placed an obstruction on the track, it might be noticed in time for the locomotive to stop. And even if there was a wreck, that low-down engineer might escape harm. No, Alfred had to do this job right. You see, there was a high wooden railroad bridge between the farm and the next town that spanned over a deep ravine with a rocky stream at the bottom. If that train somehow found its way at the bottom of that watery grave, why, that engineer would be grinning at the angels in no time. So, with his evil plan conceived, on Sunday, December 5th, 1926, Alfred snuck out of the barn around midnight as everyone else on the Armstrong farm slept. It was the perfect night to carry out his plan, under the clear skies with a full moon casting his shadow on the tracks as he walked briskly towards that railroad bridge with a one-man crosscut saw in his hand. Now, Alfred had heard about the new technology that lawmen were using and catching lawbreakers by using their fingerprints. Now, that wouldn't happen to him, though. He made sure to wear a pair of rawhide gloves. And the day before, Alfred had told old man Armstrong that he was going out for a fishing trip. But in reality, the farmhand had spent that morning scouting out the bridge in question. He saw that there were 3 main stringers that ran the length of the bridge. If they somehow failed, anything trying to cross would plunge to the bottom of the deep ravine. But you see, those stringers were long and heavy timbers, 12 by 18 inches, but they would prove to be no match for a man blinded by jealousy and a sharp saw. There in the moonlight, for over an hour, Alfred took out all of his pent-up frustration as he pulled and pushed the razor-sharp saw back and forth as its teeth melted through the stringers like a hot knife does through butter. But how far should he cut into them? If he cut too far, the bridge would surely collapse, with Alfred still standing on it. And as he stood there trying to decide, he heard a huge crack and felt the bridge move a bit under his feet. Oh no, he had surely cut too much. So he started to run for his life off the bridge. Heck, that thing might not even hold up until the morning and might collapse under its own weight. So Alfred ran as fast as he could back to the farm and returned the saw to its usual place and ditched his gloves along the side of the tracks and was back in his bed before the roosters crowed. Morning came soon, and red-eyed and sore, Alfred took his usual place behind the plow and awaited the big moment. It was so quiet out in the fields that the train could be heard coming for miles. And sure enough, the faint sound of the steam engine could be heard chugging along as it crossed Sassafras Ridge and headed towards Snapneck Creek. Oh, it won't be long now, Alfred thought, as his heart started pumping a rush of adrenaline throughout his body. Louder and louder and closer the engine roared. Surely it must have hit that bridge by now. Yet the sound of the train was so close that pretty Grace came running out of the kitchen to her customary spot in the field that bordered the tracks, and 3 toots echoed through the air. As the glove-waving engineer was flashing that cheese-eating grin and blowing kisses at Grace, who was running through the field trying to keep pace with the handsome engineer of her dreams, as she waved back and placed her hand over her heart before blowing a big old kiss back to him. 4 more toots, and then the locomotive disappeared around the bend. How in the world was this possible? There's no way a heavy train could have crossed that crippled bridge. But somehow, it had. In fact, the next 2 days came and went, with the lover boy engineer making his daily appearance at the Armstrong farm, to the heart-throbbing delight of Grace. And you see, in reality, there were several trains that rolled over that bridge each day, and many of them were carrying passengers. Somehow, over 20 trains had crossed that bridge, with all 3 of its main stringers sawed in half. Now you have to keep in mind that during the 1920s, railroads were the equivalent of interstates of the modern day, and much like highway departments of today are monitoring the condition of bridges and roads, railroads of the 1920s employed inspectors who constantly ensured that the tracks were safe for travel. So, on December 8th, just 3 days after Alfred cut the main timbers on the bridge, a track inspector discovered the damage and promptly shut down all passenger trains. As a full investigation was launched, it was clear that someone had used a saw to inflict the damage, and each time the blade had struck a nearby timber or the soft earth surrounding the tracks, it left distinctive marks, not only revealing the length of the saw, but also what type of cutting teeth it had. Railroad detectives quickly sought out the only man in Hazard County who was responsible for sharpening all the saws in the area, and that man was Charles Smith. Once Mr. Smith arrived to the scene, there was no doubt about it. There was only one saw in the entire county with teeth like that, and it took him little time to identify the saw in question as the cross saw belonging to the Armstrong farm. Sure enough, the saw was quickly located in the tool shed of the farm, and it even had pieces of the railroad lumber still sticking between its teeth. Now, Mr. Armstrong was a well-respected man in the community, and no one believed for a single second that he committed this terrible crime, which could have resulted in the deaths of so many innocent passengers that depended on that railroad bridge with their lives. This was not of his character, and he was quickly eliminated as a suspect. However, when Alfred Busher was questioned, he was evasive and gave vague answers about his whereabouts, and he couldn't even seem to look the detectives in their eyes. The lawmen decided to bring him into jail and let him spend a few nights there to see if he'd change his tune. Over and over for the next 10 days, investigators questioned the lowly farmhand, and finally, when he realized that he was facing 10 years in prison for his crime, after all, the investigators said, had he cut just a little bit deeper into those boards, this would be a murder case. He could hide his secret no longer, and Alfred Busher admitted to trying to collapse the railroad bridge to kill the Illinois Central train engineer because he was blowing kisses at a girl that Alfred was obsessed with. Indeed, love is a curious thing and can lead a man who is blind with it to do things that a rational thinking man never would. For Alfred Busher, he hoped his actions would lead him to the gates of heavenly affection from the beautiful country girl named Grace. But instead, it landed him in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, where he would do hard time for the next 2 years. And Grace, well, she married a few years later to a man named Harry Watson, and nobody knows if he was a train engineer or not. But together, they would have 8 children. Ironically, it was one of Grace's grandchildren who recently reached out to me and asked me to share this story with you. Speaking of that, if you have a story idea that you'd like to see on the Appalachian Storyteller, email me at the appalachianstoryteller@gmail.com. But for now, in the words of a hero of mine. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story about Alfred Busher, the man who tried to get even with the kiss-blowing, glove-waving railroad engineer who stole the heart of the woman he loved. Till next time, my friends, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.